The wind that morning carried dust and the kind of silence that meant something in town had gone wrong. Ethan Callahan knew it the moment he rode past the old wooden sign welcoming travelers to Dry Creek. The town was never lively, but today the quiet felt heavier, like grief hanging in the air. He adjusted the brim of his worn hat and guided his horse slowly down the main road. He had only come for grain. Winter was approaching fast, and his ranch sat nearly 30 miles outside town. The cattle needed feed, and Ethan didn't plan to stay longer than an hour. But fate had other plans. As he tied his horse outside Miller's General Store, he noticed the small crowd gathered across the street. People stood in front of a modest white church, their heads bowed, their voices hushed. A funeral. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't the kind of man who lingered around sorrow. Life on the frontier had taught him that grief came often and left scars that never truly healed. Still, something made him glance toward the church door. That was when he saw her. She stood slightly apart from the others, dressed in a simple black dress that seemed too thin for the cold wind. Her hands were clasped tightly together, and her dark hair was tied loosely behind her head. Though her face looked calm, her eyes held a depth of pain Ethan recognized immediately. She was young, too young to be standing beside a grave. Poor thing, an old man muttered beside Ethan. That's Mary Whitaker. Lost her husband 2 days ago. Fever took him fast. Ethan frowned. Anyone helping her? He asked. The old man shook his head. Not much to help with. The farm's near gone. Debt collectors been circling like buzzards. She's got nowhere to turn. Ethan looked again. Mary Whitaker stood alone as the coffin was lowered into the ground. Not a single person stood beside her. Something inside Ethan shifted. He quickly turned away and entered the general store. The smell of grain sacks and leather filled the room. Mr. Miller stood behind the counter, counting coins. Morning, Ethan, he said. What'll it be? 2 sacks of winter grain. While Miller prepared the order, Ethan kept glancing through the dusty window toward the churchyard. Mary still hadn't moved. When the crowd slowly dispersed, she remained there, staring down at the grave as if part of her had been buried with it. Ethan sighed. He had no reason to care. Yet something in that lonely figure refused to leave his mind. Your grain, Miller said, dropping the sacks onto the counter. Ethan paid and stepped outside. Mary was now walking slowly down the road, her shoulders slightly hunched against the cold wind. Without thinking, Ethan mounted his horse and rode after her. Ma'am. She stopped. When she turned around, Ethan saw how tired her eyes looked, like someone who hadn't slept in days. Yes. Her voice was soft but steady. I heard about your husband, Ethan said awkwardly. I'm sorry. She nodded once. Thank you. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Ethan asked the question that had been bothering him. What happens now? Mary gave a small, bitter smile. Now, I suppose the bank takes the farm. Ethan frowned. That quick? 3 months behind on payments, she replied. My husband was sick longer than we realized. The wind tugged at her dress as she looked down the empty road. I'll figure something out. But Ethan could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Do you have family? He asked. She shook her head. Not anymore. Ethan leaned slightly forward in his saddle. You know anything about ranch work? Mary looked up, surprised. A little. My father owned land when I was young. Ethan hesitated only a moment before speaking. My ranch could use help. It's not easy work, but it's honest. If you need somewhere to stay, until you find your footing, you're welcome there. Mary stared at him. Most men in town had ignored her all day. Now a stranger was offering her shelter. Why would you help me? She asked quietly. Ethan shrugged. Because someone should. For the first time since the funeral, something softened in Mary's expression. Still, she looked uncertain. You don't even know me. That's true, Ethan said. But I know what it's like to lose everything. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Mary studied him carefully. Did you? Ethan nodded. 5 years ago. Fever took my wife and boy. Mary's eyes widened slightly. I'm sorry. He tipped his hat. Point is, nobody should face the world alone. The wind howled softly through the empty street. Finally Mary spoke. Your ranch, where is it? 30 miles west. And you're certain this isn't charity? Ethan shook his head. I need help with the cattle and land. You'd earn your keep. Mary looked back toward the cemetery one last time. Then she took a slow breath. I suppose, I don't have many choices. Ethan reached down and held out his hand. Then let's ride. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. That afternoon, the cowboy who had come to town for grain rode out with something far more unexpected. A widow with nowhere else to go. The journey back to Ethan's ranch took nearly half the day. The open plains stretched endlessly around them, golden grass swaying under the pale autumn sun. Mary rode quietly beside him. Occasionally she asked questions about the ranch, the cattle, or the land. Ethan answered simply. When they finally reached the property just before sunset, Mary's eyes widened. The ranch was large, though weathered. A wooden house stood at the center, surrounded by wide fields and a distant barn. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Ethan dismounted. "Needs work." Inside the house, dust coated the furniture, but everything was sturdy. Mary walked slowly through the rooms. "Have you lived here alone all this time?" she asked. "Yes." She turned toward him. "That must have been lonely." Ethan shrugged. "You get used to silence." But over the following weeks, the silence began to change. Mary worked harder than Ethan expected. She helped repair fences, fed cattle, cleaned the house, and even learned to ride better than most ranch hands. Little by little, the ranch began to feel alive again. Laughter returned. Warm meals filled the kitchen. The lonely cowboy who once avoided town now found himself talking late into the night with a woman who understood grief better than anyone. But trouble wasn't finished with them yet. One cold evening, 3 riders appeared at the ranch. Debt collectors. They had come for Mary. "You still owe the bank," their leader said. "Widow or not." Mary stood frozen. Ethan stepped forward. "She doesn't live there anymore." The man smirked. "Debt follows people." Ethan stared at them for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised even himself. "I'll pay it." Mary turned sharply. "Ethan, you can't." He raised a hand. "Yes, I can." The debt was nearly everything Ethan had saved over years of ranching. But as the riders left, Mary looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Why would you do that for me?" Ethan took a slow breath. "Because when I rode into town, I thought I was just buying grain." He met her eyes. "Turns out I was finding a reason to live again." Mary's voice trembled. "You changed my fate too." Months passed. Spring arrived. The ranch flourished like never before. And one evening, as the sun set across the endless plains, Ethan realized something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The cowboy who had once ridden into town alone had unknowingly brought home the one thing he thought he'd lost forever. A future. And sometimes, the road that changes your life begins with the simplest errand, and a stranger who needs you just as much as you need them.